Does it work? I should turn it on. Now it works. Okay. Good evening and welcome. I think it's only half a year ago since I stood here and welcomed David RUY for the first time. And it's a pleasure to be able to do so again. And if I, despite that, may also remind you that David is an architect and a theorist based in New York. He studied at Columbia University, and that was after he took a Bachelor of Arts from St. John's College, where he focused on studied philosophy and mathematics. He's currently a professor at, associate professor at the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design at the Pratt Institute. And we're also very lucky, after an intense 3.5 days with Jeffrey Kipnis last week, David also travels this time in company of Catherine Ingraham, which I will have the pleasure of introducing tomorrow. And she's a colleague of David's at Pratt. Together with Carol Klein, David is then the principal of RUY Klein, an experimental practice that has been widely published and was in 2011 named the Emerging Voices, received the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York. And that basically recognizes the firm as one of the leading experimental practices in architecture today. Now, you may also remember, till recently, that the practice and the work of David was principally examining contemporary design at the intersection of architecture, nature, and technology. David has of more recently turned his close attention to architecture's relation to specific philosophical ideas. And those are ideas that are authored in part and propagated by his close friend Graham Harman and his object-oriented ontology, which in turn falls in under the broader term speculative realism. Now, intensely and funnily experimental, I think. The work on and teachings of David is accompanied by a relentless willingness to speculate. Speculate on the future of our discipline and also on architecture's relevance and power, or lack thereof, in a broader cultural and political field. Or, if I may paraphrase David's final remark, in a recent conversation with Harman and some architectural colleagues published in log number 33, David says, "One thing is certain. We are grappling with the here and now, and we are interested in taking a hard and close look at the shortcomings of our intellectual patrimony." David, we're delighted to have you back. Please welcome.
It's quite unusual to be giving a lecture so close together. So it's a challenge to come up with something new to say. And so what I thought I would do is try to expand on the November lecture, which was primarily oriented towards our work and a few ideas governing it. And follow up on it more, do a kind of footnote on the previous lecture to expand on what else is happening behind it. And instead of showing you my work this time, I thought it would be fun for me to show you what I've been doing with my students. My time is pretty much split 50-50 between working in the office and working in schools. And I never saw my engagement with academia as purely one of teaching, that is imparting knowledge that somehow I've constructed and kind of broadcasting it to a kind of passive student. I rather would like to think of what I do in academia as very collaborative, and I work with my students to push on ideas, and oftentimes I'm very surprised by what happens there, things that I never would have done on my own, too. So I start with this image behind me, just as a kind of prologue. Let me first tell you who's in the picture. From left to right, you have Ferda Kolaton, who's a very dear friend of mine and one of my closest colleagues on the East Coast in the United States. Ferda Kolaton has a practice in New York called SU 11, and he teaches, he has been teaching for a number of years, almost 12 years now, at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Next to him, you have Rhett Russo, who teaches at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, which is near New York City. And then you have Graham Harmon, who Johan just mentioned. Then, I don't know who the guy is next to him. And all the way on the other end, you have Jason Payne, who is a professor at UCLA in Los Angeles. This was, the table was at Istanbul in the first of what turned out to be many discussions that this kind of cohering group of people would have. This was at the previous Istanbul Biennale, and the subject was how Graham's ideas, the kind of agitation he brought to us was affecting our thought. And it was kind of a discussion about the future of architecture. Then again, there's Ferda again. Next to him is Tom Wiscombe, who is a professor at SciArc, also in Los Angeles. Next to him, again, I don't know who this guy is. And then you have Graham again, this time in New York City. New person here, Michael Young. So these are generally the major players. One person that's not included in these photographs is Mark Gage, who's also an active participant in this brewing discussion. So in many different places, under different contexts, over the past 3 years, this discussion has been developing, and now some opinions are forming, and most recently this was the article that Johan had mentioned. Cynthia Davison and Log curated a number of articles with regard to what appears to be a curious resurgent interest in objects, as opposed to, say, fields or networks or external influences, a renewed interest in things themselves. So this is kind of background. I just wanted to signal that this is a growing discussion. It's quite early in the discussion. And because it's early, the work that we're doing quite hasn't matured yet. But you'll be seeing more and more of it, I think. But primarily, the active experimentation is right now taking place in the schools where each of us teach. And I think the role of academia is of fundamental importance in the construction of architectural discourse. And you're all included in that. You're part of that now. And also, some of you have a studio with Peter Trummer, am I right? Yeah, and Peter Trummer has also been very active in these discussions as well. So the title of tonight's talk is Techniques of Estrangement. And the title hopefully will become clearer as I go on. Because I spoke recently, I'm going to show just a few things to remind you of what we talked about last time, but mostly it's going to be a new talk. So I'm going to start with this video that I showed last time, and we'll just let it play for a little bit. So back in November, I used this short clip to ask all of us to think a little bit about what kinds of problems that new technologies are bringing to us and how we might respond to it as architects. Do we perpetually deny it in search of something that's old and enduring in the discipline, or do we radically embrace things like this and consider how things like this might affect our discipline? Today, I want to talk about something a little bit more specific, something a little less general. I want to talk about why this is so disturbing. This is not like the rest of the machines, say, in this space. You're not thinking twice about those machines in the back of the room. This machine that receives digital signals through a wire and converts it to an image and projects it here. We don't think twice that you're looking at a projected electronic image on the wall. It's pretty weird stuff, you know, if you sit and stare at it for a while. You begin to realize just how absolutely bizarre some of these technologies are. Not to mention the video, not to mention this microphone, the air conditioning, or lack thereof, or this computer. Yes, we're surrounded by machines, and they're designed in such a way to recede into background. They don't reveal themselves in the foreground, where we might see just how strange they actually are. What's so disturbing about this video is there's something so raw about this. We haven't seen machines like this yet. Already, I think some of you are becoming familiar with these Boston Dynamics clips. Incidentally, I don't know if I mentioned it last time or not, they were purchased by Google. So now Google owns this company that was originally funded by the Defense Advanced Research Project, which is a division of the United States military. So if you hunt on YouTube, you can also find old promo videos by the US Army, where there are Army Rangers moving through the brush with rifles trailed by these guys. Can you imagine this coming over the hill? Right? Yeah. And this behavior is so odd. We don't expect machines to move this way. And just the chucking of that concrete block, there's some shock there. So what I find really amazing about this video is that it refuses to go into background. It's not like the refrigerator where we might have it in our apartment, in our home, and we don't think twice about it. It's white like the walls. You see it every day. You don't notice it until it breaks. This sucker demands attention, and it's in foreground, and it's not hiding what it is. And it's a shocking video because I remember the first time I saw these videos by Boston Dynamic, I remember thinking to myself, my God, is this real? You know, is this some kind of hoax? Somebody making this up? Because it didn't resemble anything I knew. This condition of unfamiliarity or strangeness is what I'm interested in talking about today. Last time I spoke to you at some length about our collaboration with two biologists and a fabricator of 3D printers in fabricating what we call the bioprinter. Most people, when I show them this project, are primarily focused on possible applications. That is, what can it do? Will this thing be able to print me a new heart? Will it be able to print me a new ear? I gotta have hip replacement surgery. Is there a chance this thing can make that process easier, or so on? And this is how we generally think, and this is how we have these technologies become more familiar also. We want to know what it does because that's what brings it home. That's what puts it into categories of understanding. That's how it enters into our world. And it was very deliberately done to resist that. So it is very much an art project, I suppose, insofar as the interest here was really not about producing a technological innovation. The project was about looking at technological innovation itself as a type of problem, as a type of value, and as a function that then makes certain objects more familiar to us. And I wanted to see if I could do something similar to that Boston Dynamic video of that robot animal that throws the concrete block. Can I bring this technology into the foreground where we could see it for what it is? So it was very important to us to scrutinize every part and to not just make a model of it, but for it to actually work. And that's ironic because at the same time, I'm not interested in what it does. However, in order to get at the problem, it had to work nonetheless. So we went through all kinds of technical problems to figure out how to do this. These are all the parts that went into fabricating this custom printer. And there was a fascinating process with the scientists, the fabricator, and my students, architecture students. These were students from my architecture studio at Pratt. And of course, they all jumped on the opportunity to work on something so strange. There's like a saw coming through the wall, I think. So it wasn't so much what it could do, but I was interested in everything that went into it. The 1,000,001 relationships between things and peoples and ideas that had to come together somehow in order to make this thing, in order to print flesh. And it's not just any flesh, as I told you, it's also glow-in-the-dark flesh because it was genetically engineered with traits from phosphorescent jellyfish. But again, it wasn't really about this. It was more about this, what it was like to clean the cells with chemicals, what it was like to incubate it, what kind of machine do we use to incubate it, what kind of space are we in, at what temperature, who, why, what do they know that I don't know, what does that person know, why do these people need to work together? These are the things that interested me. This is one of my favorite slides from the entire project. This is the protocol that one of the biologists outlined for us to incubate the cells and to culture them. This strange recipe. And I wanted to do precisely what I'm doing now with you. I wanted to bring it into foreground, not some generic technology that we can dismiss because it's technological and People must know what they're doing, and I don't care about that. But let's look at it really closely. What is it really doing? What are these objects? What's being brought into a relationship? Exactly what is it? And take a long, hard look at it. Ultimately, I think of this contraption that we built as a mini building. I would like, ultimately, as we move forward from this project, I would like my buildings to be like this. I want there to be a vague relationship between whether it's technology or something aestheticized. I want it ambiguous whether it's in the background or it's in the foreground, or it fluctuates, goes back and forth. And it's absolutely designed. There were 1,000,001 aesthetic decisions about what type of camera. We have a choice of 10. This one has a little light at the end. This one's pink, this one's white. Okay, let's go with the white one. We want to light the print bed. What color should it be? Why do we need it? We don't need it. We like the way it looks. Why do we like the way it looks? Because it brings it more into the foreground. It calls attention to something. So here's the image that I always show in every single one of my lectures. To remind you, the story of Frankenstein is about a piece of technology that runs amok. It's the monster that is technology. But look at the way it's composed in the movie. Look at the way Frankenstein has been designed. Look at the context that the director put this designed object in. It's black and white. It's deliberately referring to some well-known landscape paintings. It's quite smart. We have other kinds of technological monsters today. So I don't know if you've seen one of these driving around Frankfurt. I think it's pretty much in every city in the world now. This is the car, the custom-built car that goes around photographing our cities, owned by Google. It automatically uploads wirelessly images that it's photographing to Google's central database. So John Raffman tracked the locations of these Google cars, and he discovered if he follows them very closely, he'll be able to see the images that were uploaded before they've been edited by the moderators. And Google edits it heavily because, of course, some really weird stuff happens in our cities. Like, for example, what you see here. So this is an example of a scene that was then deleted, and then the car would go back to photograph it when it's more normal. And that interests me quite a bit. This very strange project of photographing the entire world that Google is now nearing completion, believe it or not, has a very strange agenda behind it. It's moderated with an idea of what our world already looks like, which is the criteria for editing out those images that would show a different world, a world that's not familiar. So the normal photos you would see when you go to Google Street View are heavily moderated and edited to approach a condition of normalcy. It looks familiar. It looks the way you expect things to look. Here are some of the other glitches that happen, which I find utterly fascinating. And John Raffman, he's not a hobbyist, he's an artist. And the implication is that this is a new form of mediation that is determining a different aesthetic possibility for us now. there is an estrangement that is taking place through this new medium that should be paid attention to. And this project of pirating these non-moderated images, these deviant images before they're deleted, is a very critical project then. And it's a project of challenging this principle of the familiar, and it estranges this project of photographing the world. It prolongs the attention. You got to look at it for a while. It demands a more attenuated gaze by us. This is what I find so fascinating about some of the work that I guess you would locate in photographic arts today. This is what is now a famous art project. It's a team of 4 Dutch artists, and what this is the parting of the Red Sea as captured by satellite photography. Photoshopped, of course. And this is fascinating because it's paying attention to new forms of mediation. It understands that we spend a lot of time looking at satellite photography, that we check Google every day, that we move through the world with the aid of this tool. And to some degree, what we think is real is now conditioned by this form of mediation. So it's a fascinating project to then take something that is so fundamentally unphotographable or not real, and to distill it into this medium. And then it produces this kind of uncanny moment for us where we're not used to seeing subject matter like this through this form of mediation. So this gave me an idea with my students. Instead of line drawings that we would call a site plan, I started asking them around 2 years ago to, instead of doing a site plan, go into a time machine, go into the future, and take a screenshot of Google Earth of your project after it's built, and bring it back. And they brought back images like this. So I've become very interested in new forms of representation that then study the constraints and possibilities of our new media. What does your project look like on Google Earth? That's the simple question. Last time I also showed you this project that we're doing with the company Tidal Electric for this new infrastructure that will generate electricity from tidal changes. And that's pretty much what we told Tidal Electric. They came to us asking us if we could help them rethink their technology so that it would have cultural content. Or maybe another way of saying it, help them to rethink the design of this technology so that it could intersect with other interests, political in nature. So what we told them was the primary problem you're facing is people are having trouble thinking of this as real. People are having difficulty seeing this in the world out of resistance to wanting to see it in the world, all the way to, I just can't see it. I just can't picture what it's like. So we proposed to them, well, let's do a series of renderings of what this project will look like from the satellite after it's built. And it produces some funny kinds of questions for us because it is also so large that even if you go there, you probably wouldn't see anything. And therefore, it becomes a facade that's only viewable through satellite photography. And things like this, I think, raise for me entirely new possibilities for architecture. It's still the same discipline because we're still talking about facade, we're still talking about morphological consistency, or at least we do it in the office. We would probably never say that at the meeting. But there is nonetheless still problems of the architectural discipline, even though it's a facade that's pointed towards space. So this word estrangement comes from Victor Shklovsky. In 1917, Victor Shklovsky wrote a seminal article called Art as Technique. And he was 24 years old at the time. He was a part of a group of revolutionaries at the dawn of the Soviet Revolution. It was a moment where Shklovsky says it was like a drunken circus with pure chaos all around us, where anything seemed possible and the project seemed to be essentially the problem of constructing a new world. So it was before the horrors of Stalin and nuclear proliferation and the space race and the conflict with the Eastern Front. It was before all of this. It was when the revolution was just starting and everything seemed to be about to change. At this moment in history, Victor Shklovsky was leading a charge in literary theory, a revolution in itself in literary theory, which is now referred to as Russian formalism. The key concept here for Victor Shklovsky was the function of the work of art is to make the familiar unfamiliar. This is a quote from his article, Art as Technique. Habitualization devours work, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. If the whole complex lives of many people go on unconsciously, then such lives are if they had never been. And art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic and in itself and must be prolonged. So this is precisely what I was talking about with what's so powerful about the videos from Boston Dynamics, that it's an estrangement of something that we thought we knew, that is machines. But this goes for anything. When life feels like it's degenerating into utter mediocrity and banality and boredom, what we need is something to make life unfamiliar again. We do something to make daily life a little bit stranger once again. For Shklovsky, this is the essential function of art. And the famous word in Russian, I know there are a few Russian citizens here, is astronomy. And it roughly translates imperfectly into English as defamiliarization or making strange, to making the familiar unfamiliar. And in this time, you also had Malevich producing a completely new form of abstraction for the painterly arts and this famous black square. This idea of completely rethinking the formal logic of painting from its bare bones and to reduce it to its absolute essence. But What I find very interesting in these moments is the incorporation of abstraction for the purpose of estrangement. Abstraction is the very thing that defamiliarizes the familiar. As a footnote, I think we should all be reminded why Shklovsky is somebody we really haven't heard of until very recently. I think you have to be kind of a hardcore academic to really appreciate this tradition. His text went untranslated into English for a very long time. It wasn't until around 2001 that the first republishing project got underway. And the reason why he became a bit of a forgotten figure, even though he was of great importance in Russian culture in the 20th century, was because once the Soviet Revolution consolidated and it began to understand where its dangers lie, Stalin comes along and tags Russian formalism as subversive, that it was dangerous because it was a practice of abstraction that would only be understood by the elites, by the intellectual elite, and that it had a fundamental purpose of making the familiar things unfamiliar, including their political agenda. So Shklovsky and a number of others were imprisoned, academic posts stripped, some were even killed. Shklovsky had an amazing way of coming back and surviving. He lived to the age of 91 and passed away in 1984. And what Russian formalism was replaced by was socialist realism, art for the people, art that was politically conscious. It's paintings depicting workers building the new Russia. It's art that then reinforced the political agenda of the time. So I dwell on this a little bit because I think it's important to remember that the problem of disciplinary autonomy versus political consciousness in the arts already has a history, and a difficult, ugly history. So I think when there is a call to be somehow more political and more activist in, say, architectural practice, I think you should be reminded of this kind of history. The project of disciplinary autonomy is not apolitical. It just has a different politics. And it does have a politics of estranging whatever is the tendency for politics to make reality more familiar according to its aims. It's perpetually challenging it. Meanwhile, outside of the Soviet Union, abstraction proceeds, and you know this history quite well. So this is a famous art dealer that Picasso knew quite well, and this is his portrait of this well-known figure in Parisian culture, and it's probably been shown a million times in art history courses as emblematic of analytic cubism. Later, you have people like Francis Bacon. Now, in art history, these would be kind of categorized as altogether unrelated schools of thought and artistic phenomena. But I'm pairing these things together, combining them together, to emphasize how abstraction is being used to estrange the real. Even something completely unrelated to, I guess, more proper locations of artistic abstraction, that is pop. Even in pop, you have this function that is nonetheless abstract, perhaps abstract in a different way. But on the right-hand side, that's not Marilyn Monroe. Then you come very close to today, and you have then a figure like Chuck Close, who then begins to look at how, say, digital media or mechanized reproduction of photographic images already have a kind of built-in bias to produce an estrangement in and of itself. And he's playing now not so much with a cubistic estrangement or dealing with coloration or flatness. Now pixelation becomes a kind of technique of estrangement, if you will. So this is where my title of the lecture may be coming into closer focus. These are examples of how abstraction is used as techniques of estranging the familiar. Now, Chuck Close begins to be more interesting because this is a little different from the previous photographs. In the previous photographs, you take for granted that the image on the left was the real one before it was estranged by painterly abstraction. Now you have Chuck Close who realizes the photograph itself is pretty abstract as well, that the camera already estranges the real. In fact, we may not have any access to what we might call then an absolutely real, but somehow what we think of as reality is bound up to this medium of, say, photography. But how is, say, Google Earth different? Our notion or understanding of access to the real is somehow bound and constrained to that medium. Even if we're looking at each other right now, some of you might have different vision than I do. There may be somebody that's colorblind here. Some of you might be drunk. We may not be seeing each other for what we are at all. Right? It's mediated by binocular vision, by my education. And where do we stop? When do we ever have an unmediated or immediate encounter with the real? Ever. When is the real not constructed? Going from the sacred to the profane, this is a hilarious website I found where this person collects fakes, looking for gotchas. So this guy who put up these images saying he owned the largest cat in existence, he busted it as a kind of a joke, a hoax. Here's another one. Yeah. You've heard of things like this, haven't you? Photoshopped doctoring of celebrity images. They basically took Oprah Winfrey's head and put it on Anne Margaret's body and used it as the cover of the magazine. Even famous images that you see as pure documentary photography, turns out was altered. It turned out this famous picture as originally shot was the image below, and the fence post behind the woman's head looked like a spear going through her head, and thought it just looked bad, and airbrushed it out. And somehow nobody knew. We just accept it as somehow real. You may have seen this famous photograph of an iceberg. I know I've seen it at many reviews over the years. It's actually a composite of 4 different icebergs. Again, understood to be a kind of technological artifact documenting the real. It's a kind of medium of scientific understanding. We don't think twice about images like this. You think this is recent. There are some old examples, too. This very famous Civil War photograph. It turned out the person who took this picture had the corpses piled up and staged because the actual battle scene could not capture what he wanted to capture. So this was a staged photograph. This very, very famous photograph from World War I of a plane being shot down turned out to be a photograph of a model that was set on fire. For many, many years, this was taken as a documentary artifact. There is ongoing debate about Robert Capa's famous photograph from the Spanish Civil War. This is one of the most famous photographs of all time. It's still a debate whether or not this was staged or not, whether this was actually a person being shot or somebody merely falling backwards for the photography. This great photograph from the victory at Iwo Jima, there's a bronze statue of this in Washington, D.C. I believe it's in Washington, D.C. Apparently, the photographer who saw the original event was so upset that he didn't have his camera on him, asked the soldiers to go back up the mountain and redo it. Yeah. And again, it's taken as a kind of historical document. And then this is the one I obsess over the most. I show it to every single one of my students before they start to render their projects. I show them this picture. This was part of a portfolio of 6 photographs released by the White House photographer. It came right before the previous election, and the narrative was going through the endless archive of photographs I've taken of Barack Obama over the years. I found these 6 photographs that I thought everybody should see because it's a different Barack Obama than one you might think. It's not this kind of stiff, professorial, emotionless figure, but it's kind of down-to-earth, accessible. Now, if you look at this very closely, it's just perfect timing, isn't it? Almost too perfect. And I'm not sure with this one, how real it is, because I do like the guy. But it's almost too good to be true. And then you should go online and look for the other ones. All of them are quite perfect. So in the world of photography, there are some very interesting people that have been putting pressure on our reliance on the photographic medium as a kind of access or doorway to the real. And this is John Fontcuberta, who I find incredibly interesting. He has a series of photographs that he took that are completely doctored, dealing with fake imaginary animals. Then he has another series where he makes up a fake Soviet space program, and this is John Fontcuberta on the left, kind of putting him himself inside the documents. Yeah, there he is again. There he is again. Here's another contemporary photographer, Cedric Delceau, who very carefully takes a type of photographs of kind of gritty, abandoned urban conditions. There's scenes in the city that just look very authentic, somehow real. Then he photoshops objects from Star Wars into it, very carefully. Now, if you look at this, it has the function of estranging the content. It's not estranging the stormtroopers, it's estranging the urban context and putting pressure on this idea that somehow scenes like this depict a real. He's questioning the aesthetics of the realism of photography like this, and pointing out realism is as abstract as anything else. It's as abstract as Cubism. Thomas Demann, who is a German artist, made this image. I don't know if you know his work and if you could see what's wrong with this. This is the Oval Office, but something's wrong with it. The details are a little off. It doesn't look quite right. It's because of what he does is he collects old photographs of famous things, whether it's the Oval Office or the underground tunnel where Princess Diana got into a car accident or a break-in at the Nigerian embassy, and then he proceeds to build some of the most fastidious chipboard architectural models that he can, reconstructing the space of the photograph. Then he photographs it again, but this time he's photographing the model. That's why it looks a little off. Here's another photographer who, like Gregory Crutzen, both of these photographers have a very interesting practice of staging the photographs. So if you just look at this image, it's almost on the borderline of something that you could photograph. Gregory Crutzen has been living in the small town for, I believe, close to 10 years now. And when he picks a scene that he wants to photograph, like a person he wants to do a portrait of, he asks them, can I take a picture of you? So this is a woman that lives in this small town. And what kind of town is this? Why is her floor flooded? Where are those lights coming from the outside? Why is her house like this? What is she staring at? It looks odd because when Gregory Crutzen finds a subject that he wants to photograph in this town, he then proceeds to do this. He reconstructs the person's home. He poses them. He has some of the most expensive photographic equipment available, and he takes a single photograph. Yeah, it is amazing. It is pretty funny. Yeah, I laughed too when I saw this. And what does this do? It has the effect of, again, estranging and making strange the real town. There is the boring, mediocre, everyday town that you wouldn't think twice about if you drove through it, and he turns it into something else. He prolongs your gaze. He makes you pay attention to it. He brings it into the foreground. And then it has a kind of byproduct. What you thought was real really falls into imbalance. A while ago, this technique was incredibly popular. This is called the tilt-shift technique. It comes from old cameras, like this one. There are more recent versions of the tilt-shift mechanism as well. You could buy a Nikon lens that could do the same thing, where you could tilt and shift the relationships internally in the lens to correct for parallax and to make angles like let's say you're at the bottom of a skyscraper and you're pointing the camera up and the lines are foreshortening. You could tilt and shift the lens to actually straighten it back up again. It's quite amazing. But using the tilt-shift technique, you can begin to artificially alter the depth of field, where you get kind of strange conditions of what's in blur and what's in focus. So some people got the clever idea that you could alter then the depth of field to make big things look small or small things look big. So here's the previous photograph I started with, before and after. So the artificial depth of field and the blurring of the scene has the effect, a kind of uncanny effect of making this real scene look more like a model of the scene. And again, it's a kind of technique of estrangement. It takes the thing that you thought was real and turns it into something else, where you begin to see the abstraction in it. This is something that I've been experimenting with my students at Pratt in a seminar on advanced techniques of representation. Let me show you some of the images students have made. This was a fascinating series. The student, and I learned about the tilt-shift technique from this student, And what he did was he took, and this was not that far after 9/11, so the city was still quite traumatized by 9/11. And you saw photographs of Ground Zero all the time, every night on the news. And what he did was he took some very famous photographs of Ground Zero and applied the tilt-shift technique to make it look more like a model of the actual grounds. Again, it's a technique of estrangement. It defamiliarizes this image that was burned into our consciousness. He had other images where he started doing things like this, where he started photoshopping Lego figures into some of these photographs, but now in silhouette. And they're very strange pictures. That defamiliarizes events that we know that are all too familiar. Here are some of the other images that have been made in this class over the years. This one I like very much. I started wanting to research other modes of representation because I started perceiving around the year 2005 that digital rendering was absolutely destroying the intelligence of architectural representation. That the search for photorealism and the technical simulation of what the project would look in the real was actually doing the exact opposite. It was actually pushing digital geometry to a point of familiarity, where what became familiar was not its resemblance to actual life, but its resemblance to an accepted form of digital representation. The goal was to make it look like a digital rendering. And it seemed that it was missing opportunities to have far more critical, strange, weirder agendas in why you would render a project at all. So this was his project, which was a pretty crazy project, up above, these kind of tentacle-like bridges, but then to photograph it as though it's kind of off to the side, incidental. It's not the primary focus of the camera. It's blurry, it's been faded, it's black and white. This seemed to be a far stranger way to get at this problem of making the project look real. That you make it look real by accepting the constraints of those forms of mediation and the technologies that we use, like cameras, that we rely upon as a doorway to the real. You make it look like the media, the mediation through which the real is understood. Is another one? Yeah. So let me shift gears here for a second. If we start thinking about buildings, you look at, say, a scene like this in Soho, in downtown New York, and you see new projects being built, like this one by Jean Nouvel, which is playing off of some of the cliches of cast iron architecture and industrial lofts. Or this one by Herzog and de Meuron. This one even goes a step further and constructs what they call digital graffiti. Kind of, what they did was they scanned actual street art and then transformed them into something that could be milled and made an aluminum fence that was somehow graffiti-like. Now, what I find so interesting is architecture itself as a medium, that is, the building itself, becomes a technique of estrangement as well. Like, we would commonly think of this as a kind of cliched historicizing of previous phenomena. But another way to think of this, I think, is through this idea of Victor Shklovsky's, that this is an act of, or technique of estranging an original through what's possible in the medium. And there's something very disciplinary about that. I've always found this project quite interesting because it resists meaning. Many people have tried to speculate what this project by Frank Lloyd Wright was all about. Well, it was inspired by Mayan temples or Japanese textiles, all kinds of explanation. Frank Lloyd Wright himself is of no help because he just says it's just an innovative way to have an air barrier and insulation and rapid fabrication of ornamented concrete tiles. But what I find so fascinating is this house has been the stage set for everything from Blade Runner to House on Haunted Hill. So what it raises for me is this question of how important is this idea of what the project is really about? And is there a really about with projects at all? Is there some essential truth to these projects? Probably not. So this kind of estrangement that might happen from grafting a completely new story onto an architectural object is, I think, not that dissimilar from things that have been happening all along in the history of the discipline itself. So you could look at something like, say, Villa Savoye, and then look at what Rem Koolhaas does. And although he never talks about this as a defamiliarization of the 5 points, it's clearly there. This is a thesis project by a student who graduated last year from Syracuse University in New York. I find it utterly fascinating. I've never met this student. I just saw it on a blog. But what she did was she combined the Villa Savoye with the Farnsworth House. I find this so interesting. And then the explanation is about the mashup and how there's really no access to what's absolutely legitimate and true about projects anymore. Everything's just floating around the internet like a junkyard. But again, it's an interesting technique of estrangement, I think. So I'm going to leave you with a few points. These are points that I made to you during the seminar talks I had with you, but it's going to be expanded a little bit here. So the first point is, and this is a conclusion that I make from all of this. One, there is no such thing as an essential representation, an absolutely true representation of a thing, especially an architectural thing. So I always love to use this example, this project on the Voyager mission, where we inscribed on a gold album, because Voyager was launched to hopefully be discovered by an alien form of life, so there had to be some artifact on board that would communicate that there's life here on Earth, intelligent life here on Earth. But what I find so great about this, it's a project of taking a picture of civilization. How do we do that? What should be on it? And so, one, it's gold because an intelligent form of life would realize that gold is not something that naturally occurs in great quantities. So it would take an intelligent form of life to distill it from the various sources. There would have to be some rudimentary diagram, because they certainly won't talk English, that would somehow indicate how the album would be played back. And then on the flip side, you could watch this on YouTube. It's actually available freely now, which was wonderful. The contents of the album, what kind of sounds are on it? Okay, we got to put some sounds on it. We got to put some ocean sounds on it, different languages being spoken, music. There's this famous Saturday Night Live skit making fun of this, where The comedy sketch is about Voyager actually being discovered by aliens, and they send a message back, and the message on the communication is, "Send more Chuck Berry." So, just pretty funny. But the actual project is really not that far, because the assumption that I guess was in question was that we could carefully, rationally consider what constitutes civilization and then produce a portrait, a kind of essential representation of ourselves. And what we don't see just in listening to how beautiful this album is, and it is beautiful, all the things that are missing on this album. It's a kind of infinite number of things that are missing from it. You're not on it, for example. I'm not on it, right? Here's a different project, similar. This is a very simple project done by Ian Bogost, where he wrote a script to randomly query Wikipedia. And Wikipedia, I don't know if you know, has a function of taking you to a random page. So it's a script that just queries it for a random page and retrieves the heading. And so it'll generate a random list of all the different headings on Wikipedia. So you get this kind of bizarre list that things you would never think of. Like, so who is Thomas Stockdale? The Uprooted Pine, Saka Republic, Monticello High School, Wasted Pieces, 87 to 93, Scalable Network Path. Like, what are all these things, right? So why isn't this the way to make the golden record? You just make the album as big as you can, and you just randomly sample all the things that are in the world. Yeah. Somehow, I feel like this is a truer representation, if you can say truer, than the Golden Album, which was an essentialized, theoretical self-portrait of everything. But this is an assumption that we know very well in the architectural discipline. The idea is underneath it all, there is something stable and enduring and something that gives us some access to an absolute, something timeless, if you will. If you ever tried this, it actually doesn't work. Nobody actually inscribes a circle, so Leonardo cheats to actually do this, right? And you could cheat like this in drawing. But the idea is quite clear, is it not? Right? There is something stable and enduring and perfect, non-contingent, autonomous, behind the world of appearances. So if you want to make new things, like a building, shouldn't you be trying to learn the stable, enduring, non-contingent, timeless thing, from which you could then reconstruct more timeless, enduring things? So when you look at the modern revisions of ideas like this, you see that it's really not about getting it right. It's more about this type of idea itself. I always return to this image. This is one of the more curious icons in the Christian tradition. This one's referred to as Christ the geometer, or I like to say Christ the architect. You see that he's holding in his hands a compass. In his lap is the universe. What I find so interesting is then logos, or rationality, the mind, is outside of the universe. I think this is the presumption of architecture, that we want to locate ourselves outside of the universe to access the thing that is somehow absolute. But this is the very thing that I think should be contested. There is no essential representation. And I don't see how we can persist in believing that in this day and age. The second point is architecture is defined by architecture. So here's some of the definitions that I've cobbled together. I generated this list by typing this into a Google search bar and seeing how it auto-completes. I particularly like architecture is yes, which actually comes from Bjarke Engels. The bottom one is quite hilarious. Architecture is a genius solution to a non-existing problem. Yeah. And some of these are not so funny and quite familiar, like the top one is the masterly correct and magnificent play of masses brought together in life. But you see, the problem is all of these reduce architecture to, it severely compresses the information content of architectural history down to a couple of sentences. So how on earth is that ever going to do the job? So ultimately, I think what architecture is can be based on nothing more than what we've been calling architecture. And this is something that's going to some degree, be different from person to person, from histories to histories, cultures to cultures. And these are just some of my favorite buildings. These are some of the architectural objects that I cannot escape. Is the stuff that's always sitting next to me when I'm designing. For me, that's more or less what architecture is. The sum total of all the buildings that I've seen already. Not just buildings, too. This, too. Third conclusion, architecture shows us what the real looks like. A bit of a digression back home to New York. This, as you know, is Times Square. I was quite disturbed recently when I saw a lecture by New York City's previous planning commissioner, Amanda Burden, who proclaimed in the lecture, New York City is the fastest growing city in the United States, by far. We're growing like crazy, and the challenges facing infrastructure and housing is enormous. However, the challenge is to grow but not change. And that I found profoundly disturbing. And you see this in New York. There are new regulations and I guess an ethic of how things should behave and what values should be imparted into public spaces that begins to project the conditions and the character of New York City as something of a complete project. That it's a set of regulations to then reinforce conditions like this. Back when Times Square was revitalized, one of the more curious planning regulations were put into place, which was minimum lumens per square foot of vertical surface area. It had to be emitting light at a minimum of some degree. They wanted this place to be super bright. With advertising, presumably. This is what Times Square looked like before. I remember this New York in the 70s. It was a pretty edgy, derelict scene. But compare these two images. Look at what architecture has done to the real. This is Soho today. This was Soho yesterday. This was a photograph taken again in the 70s. Back when New York City nearly went bankrupt during the fiscal crisis. It was a pretty rough, derelict place. There was a reason why artists settled here. And again, look what architecture has done to the real. This was the west side of Manhattan, which is now going through an incredible period of civic vitality where the entire coastline has been greened, and you got parks, you can go rollerblading and jogging, you can take your kids there. All of it wonderful, right? However, the one nagging thing for me is a kind of erasure of one form of representation with another, and the assertion that somehow the island is being returned back to what it was before is total nonsense. It looked nothing like this before. There is no Garden of Eden to go back to here. And so you look at these emblematic images of New York City. This is real New York, is it not? However, look at this picture done by an ecologist that did a bit of ecological detective work, rewinding this archipelago, this estuary, to what it probably was as an ecosystem before civilization. And I love this kind of 50-50 split screen that is part of the project. Look at what architecture has done to the real. And just if you think that somehow there was an inevitability to this version of the real, there were many projects in the history of New York that could have taken it in a very different direction. This was actually an infrastructure proposal that nearly went through, where the idea was to fill in the East River in between Manhattan and Queens, Brooklyn, make a single landmass, and then to cut actually a canal across Lower Manhattan, that is New Jersey, sorry, and then extend Manhattan's south to meet the islands to the south. And look at how around 125th Street, this canal's cut right across the island. This could have been a radically different New York City. But this is the real that we got. Yeah? But it could have been a different real. If you're in New York, you're sick and tired of reading about this, which is the High Line, which used to be a pretty interesting place. Back in the 90s when I was in grad school, I used to sneak up there. It was illegal. You could have gotten arrested for being up there. It's an old abandoned viaduct for trains because this used to be called the Avenue of Death because there were commerce-related trucks whizzing back and forth down this avenue, running people over. Then they decided to build this elevated train that would then move goods and services back and forth along the avenue. Then, of course, the industry died, and then the viaduct remained, and it was forgotten about. It was just a kind of burden, and this giant hulking piece of metal right on top of the boulevard, and what are we going to do with this thing? Just ignore it for now. So gas stations and tire shops and auto body shops and God knows what else would just kind of accumulate underneath this abandoned infrastructure. And something funny happened on top. I guess things started returning, or I guess actual nature started taking hold. And then a photographer, I guess, caught wind of how interesting this was and published a series of photographs that absolutely captivated New York. And then it led to a competition to make it inhabitable, and you had this project by Dilys Scofidio and James Corner Field Operations, and now it's an incredible civic space, and I gotta admit, it is pretty great. As a New Yorker, it's wonderful to see things like this happen in the civic realm. However, I do miss what it was, and I think what it is should be recognized for what it is, which is architecture being used to make familiar the thing that was unfamiliar. So this is the reverse now of what I've been calling for. Architecture as a series of techniques of estranging the familiar. Now here's a kind of reverse case where we take something that is deeply unfamiliar and strange, the space in this forgotten part of the city's infrastructure, and how architecture is then brought in to make it more familiar, more easy, more accessible, less scary, more controlled, more capitalizable. Real estate around this has absolutely exploded. And this is something we all know about, how architecture then becomes complicit in a project of grafting a layer of familiarity on top of something else that remains to some degree hidden. So you look at projects like this, and this is the miniature version of Paris that was built in China. Right? Now imagine growing up here and having never been to Paris. Look at what architecture does to the real. This is the $1 billion Songdo project. And it's based on the urbanism of New York. And this is a little mini Central Park that was built into it. So recently in my studios, some of these questions have been tinkered with. This is the Washington, D.C. Mall. And one of my favorite buildings, the Hirshhorn Museum by Gordon Bunshaft, is that donut there on the left. And the student project is this, what looks like a giant rock across from it, which is his new museum. Now, what I want to point out is how now I'm beginning to encourage another form of realism. Make it look like it's already built and you went to the future and brought it back from Google Earth, or make it look like it's somehow always been there. Make it look like a photograph from the 50s. Right? Play with this medium of photography and how we rely on it as a kind of representation of reality, and intervene there. So there is his site plan. What I found so interesting about his project was it seemed to have the effect of recontextualizing Washington, D.C. All of these objects that, if you're American, are all too familiar, like the Washington Monument and the rest of the National Mall. Jeff Kipnis, who was here last week, said at the review, what's so interesting about this idea of re-originating this object is it's actually re-originating these other objects in Washington, D.C. And it makes it look like the rest of the stuff was built after this new thing. Yeah. And in effect, estranges these other objects in Washington, D.C. So, to start wrapping up here, the group of people that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, these are some of the tendencies that, or ideas that we're beginning to work on. So the first problem in this idea of estranging the real or questioning how essential our architectural objects can be, the first step maybe is to just experiment with turning things into other things, or what we would say appropriation or misappropriation. The idea for this started coming from fascination with sci-fi set design. So this is a scene from J.J. Abrams' recent Star Trek movie, where there are scenes in future London. I found it so interesting because you have like a little Norma Foster building, you got something that looks like a Zaha building, then you have St. Paul's Cathedral. But the realism of it I found incredibly interesting. As though all the buildings that we know is available as almost a kind of junkyard of architectural objects that can be combined to make new worlds. I talked to you back in November about kit bashing and this idea in Star Wars of that comes out of a kind of desperation, like George Lucas tells the set designers, go design me a Death Star. What does a Death Star look like? I don't know. That's what I hired you guys for. Go design me a Death Star. They come back with a kind of sphere thing. It's like, that's not a Death Star. What is this? This is not a Death Star. It goes like this back and forth for a while, and then out of sheer desperation, they go to the hobby shop and buy every plastic model kit they could get their hands on and just start gluing shit onto the model. Yeah? And then he brings it to George Lucas, and then now we're talking, that's a Death Star. So what I found so interesting about this practice, it is, again, a kind of technique of making strange. You have something that you recognize as a car part, and you use it in a way where it's no longer a car part. The object has been estranged, and now it reads differently. It turns into something else. Something turns into something else. Let me skip some of this, or else this will go way too long. Yeah, so, Frankenstein is a kind of kit-bashed object. It's a kind of collage of different things. This is a hilarious artist, goes by the name of Mr. Brainwash. There's speculation that this is just yet another Banksy hoax, that there is no Mr. Brainwash. This is more Banksy. But it's referred to as ruination. You take two objects, Campbell soup can, stormtrooper helmet, and they kind of ruin each other. Here's another piece. So it's kind of in this kind of kit bash vein, but what I find more interesting are those kit bashed techniques where there's no seam. There's no trace of the originals anymore. It may be collage technique, but it certainly doesn't read as collage. It's not legible as collage. So this is some of the stuff that I've been experimenting with over the years. I started wondering, well, instead of constructing the drawing from scratch, let's see if you can make drawings from other drawings and have them start reading in a different way. So this is the work of one student. And if you look closely, you could actually see a couple of familiar objects, like the Millennium Falcon is in there somewhere. Here's another one. But it was quite interesting. It was the start of, I guess, assassinating the holy cow of absolute originality in an architectural project. The idea that you start from absolute zero. You start with a blank screen or blank paper. Everything you do is totally original, and you did it. It's just accepting the fact that it's never that it always comes from other things. Here's a model one of the students made, just doing something really dumb, which was to just melt them together. Right? But again, it's a problem of seams and a problem of reading it as a coherent new whole. So this isn't quite architecture yet. It's just an experiment of turning things into other things. This is a vest, but the vest is made out of rubber babies. She bought a gigantic bag of rubber babies in the toy district of downtown LA and splayed them open and butterflied it like poultry, and turned them inside out. So if you look closely on the backside, you see these weird eyes staring back at you, held together by safety pins. Yeah, this one was quite interesting. Here's another one. A student was doing a project speculating on the Large Hadron Collider, the particle accelerator at CERN, grafting new machines onto the giant tube. But this is more kind of Star Wars. It actually comes from other parts that he bought. But I think this is where it starts getting a little more high stakes. So then let's continue by turning architecture into other architecture. We've done turning things into other things. Now let's turn architecture into other architecture. And this is when I started rereading this very famous book. And I gotta admit, with some little bit of anxiety, I started looking at works from this Pomo period once again. And I was quite fascinated by the kind of flip side, we always see this side, but the back side is, it's kit bashed in a different way, right? Where you have a kind of piling up of familiar things like rooms and bad furniture. But then you look at like what came before, almost right after this with, say, the New York Five, and you look at even early Michael Graves, where he's obviously pulling apart the recognizable cliches of modernist architecture. I mean, this is basically Villa Stein being recombined in kit bash, right? And it starts making more sense when you start seeing later work, So I think there are a couple of places where it went wrong. So I would like to reread Complexity and Contradiction once again, but with two caveats. One, I don't think it should degenerate back into a problem of legibility of signs. So I would like to get rid of the flatness. I would like to get rid of the obligation to actually read it, to see the references. I would instead like to see it blend and disappear. I would like to see the references totally disappear and become coherent. And the second thing is, I don't think it should be restricted just to the past. I think the future should also be in play. So no signs, and also include the future in addition to the past, and then I think Complexity and Contradiction begins to read in a very interesting way again. And that's where I get interested in these kinds of, I guess, difficult to classify moments in modernist history, like Michelucci's Church of the Autostrada, where there's clearly a kind of kit bashing going on, but it's not legible, it's been erased, and also it's deeply speculative. It's not, somehow temporality is going in both directions with this project. So all of this has given me, I guess, a conceptual apparatus to reread some of these things that might have been just kind of idiosyncratic projects. And I want to see if they could be understood in a way that could be, that could generate some new work. So in my most recent studio at SAC, we started playing around with some of these. I think after 3 years of this now, I had, I guess, the confidence to get a little bit extreme with this. I told the students in the studio to come back, this was on the first day of class, come back tomorrow with your 3 favorite projects. Don't try to impress me with your academic knowledge. In order for this to work, and in order for what I planned for you to work, you really have to love this stuff. And they came back with some truly weird projects. And this was a group of 2 students, Jake Hartzell and Greg Ingalls, whose favorite building was the Pompidou Center. So I had them do nothing but model those projects straight with resisting interpretation as much as possible. But what I wanted them to do was to resist abstraction as much as possible. Just try to model what you can find documentation for. And then I had them take their favorite moments in all 3 buildings and start recombining them. And the single criteria was to erase any trace of how you did this. It should look like a building. It shouldn't look like parts of buildings glued together. And it was pretty interesting. There was nearly no conceptual motivation whatsoever. It just became a problem of how to glue these favorite fetishized architectural moments in a seamless way. So there's actually 3 different buildings here. Mostly it looks like the Pompidou arrayed. Then at the midway point, I sent them all a letter, an email rather, in the kind of persona of a client or congratulations, you just won this competition. We saw some of what you've been working on, and we would like you to do this. So the project became, take that and put it into a context. So this was their project. The site or context I signed was the new forum Les Halles in the year 2050, after the current one failed too. So you could see all of what I've been talking about coming into play. Pushing for a realism, which is not a kind of digital rendering photorealism, but it looks like a photograph after it's built. They did a pretty great job. Here's another group that chopped up their 3 favorite buildings into micro building parts. They ended up with a huge collection of favorite little architectural moments, and which they then combined into a tower for London. And they had this pretty interesting idea of a building that's made up of lots and lots of little buildings in a structural scaffolding. Again, it's a kind of project of turning architecture into other architecture. You see, this is still a bit of an experiment. We're slowly trying to escalate this agenda, see where we go. This is a student who was very interested in Daniel Libeskind. And even though it's so out of fashion to be into Libeskind, he truly loved Libeskind. And I, at the midway point, wrote him a letter in the disguise of the director of the Berlin Museum, asking him to do the addition to the addition. So it was kind of a chopped up, reconstituted Libeskind. And again, I thought this one was particularly interesting because the Libeskind project originally was a project of estrangement, where he takes this kind of inherited, kind of burdensome history of Berlin architecture and changes it into something else. It's a kind of exceptional object that estranges the context. And then to do an addition to that addition, I think, was such an interesting problem. And he did a very interesting job, like drawing like Libeskind's original competition drawings. So you see, what ended up becoming most interesting about this problem of estranging the architectural object, which we didn't realize until towards the end, my assistant and I were looking at each other, what do you think the studio is about? And he said, it's about context. And he was absolutely right. The most interesting things about all the projects in this most recent studio was what it did to the perception of the context, what it did to the real. It wasn't, the content was not actually in the object itself, but it's what the object did to what you think the context is, to what you think the world is, presumably. And this is at the Pratt in the studio that just ended. This was for redeveloping one of the most polluted sites on the planet, which is Newtown Creek, which is this artificial canal between Queens and Brooklyn. And she did something quite interesting here, where she had an idea of these long, linear, modulated, kind of contemporary, attenuated building forms, and then she punctuated it with famous architectural cross-sections that would then be erased formally insofar as the plans don't exist. But there are brief moments in this linear scheme where that cross-section appears and then blends back out into these straight linear buildings. almost like the ghost of some of these architectural interests then get somehow dissolved into what is a fairly contemporary formalism. And then she did these very funny, fascinating renderings where she took the project, the renderings of the project, and then carefully replaced the background of photographs of Gary Winogrand, who is one of the kind of famous documentary street photographers of mid-century, and put her project into it. But again, not like front and center, two-point perspective, all attention should be on the architectural object, but now the architecture is in the background. It's estranging the context. The focus remains on the people, on the scenes from life, and architecture somehow pushed to the background once again. So, this is my last slide. Sorry, this is a bit of a longer lecture, but it could have been longer, actually. I end with this because, to summarize, the set of ideas that Graham has brought back to the discussion are ideas that are, to some degree, quite old. It's an idea that you first see being stated very explicitly in the late 18th century by Immanuel Kant, that there are things as they appear to us, and then there is the thing in itself. And we as human beings have no access to that. We can know that it's there, and this is synonymous with reality. We know what's real is there, but it will always be contingent on how we're perceiving it. The distortions of my education or my upbringing or the country I'm from, how much sleep I got last night is going to change how I perceive what it really is. So we're always going to be kind of stuck in this world of phenomena. And what Graham Harman is arguing for is actually not that different. The only big innovation there, and it's a huge one, I think, is that this is not a special condition of the human being in relationship to the world. It's not a problem of mind. It's not an epistemology problem, but that this is a basic ontological problem between all things that exist, even between this microphone and the table, that one cannot fully access the other ever. So this is where and how Victor Shklovsky became suddenly very interesting. Because if we're stuck in a world of appearances, and this is a basic ontological problem, that what we have are essentially things as they've been somehow distorted by us through the project of representation, how things are, or what we call real is always going to be to some degree abstract. If this is the case, how do we then intervene in the problem of constructing the real? That the real is not something that you have to negotiate with, that you're always going to be in some kind of compromise with, but it's always going to be constructed through ideas. It's always going to be contingent upon the concepts that we build. And at that moment, it's squarely in the territory of architecture, and where architecture finds agency, because that's what we do. We construct representations of the real. So I want to end then with the kind of counter thesis that I found so interesting. I had heard that Slavoj Žižek was doing a session at the Princeton English department where he entitled a critique of new materialism and object-oriented ontology. I went down there with a few of my students to see what the counter-thesis would be. And I think 1 hour and 15 minutes of the 2-hour talk were about something entirely unrelated. He just digressed for most of it. But he said one thing that I thought was quite odd. What he said was the problem of the real and the not real is just one of an infinite number of dichotomies that we have, like human and non-human, nature and not nature, architecture and not architecture, that we have an endless pageant of negations. And in that gap, in the void between the thesis and the antithesis, emerges the fantasy or the image. And then asserted that's ultimately the real. The fantasies that emerge in the gap between the dichotomies. And I'm not quite sure what to make of this very odd interpretation of Hegel through Lacan, but maybe Catherine and I can pick that back up and see what we can do with it. But I guess I want to leave you with then the most esoteric comment of the night and leave you to ponder it. And this is something that's very much to be continued. This is something that's actively in process and something that I hope we can continue to work on, perhaps with you too. So thanks for a long I talked for quite a long while. Should we endure questions, or should we just go get a beer or something?
It's only urgent, but we also have some time tomorrow. Are there anyone who's joining the question? I don't know if it is going to be. That's a double negative, right? That's a double negative.
Yeah.
Oh, so don't you have some problems with scale?
What does?
In terms of the argument and some of the examples you showed, is the scale a challenge?
What would the challenge be?
Well, I mean, most of architecture is usually, I understand the use of images, but it's usually not experienced in real. I understand also the argument about images constructing the real, but still, we're not up there with the satellites. Well, and some of the projects that you're showing in the end, I was wondering, if you walk through the city, for instance, what was the last project you showed by a student? Was that in Paris? No.
No, that's was for New York.
Right. But I mean, you would hardly, in the images you show, in the image montage, those would be probably ways of seeing it or experiencing it. But most of the images of the project before would be views that one would never be privileged to have.
Well, what I would say about then, can these ideas scale up or down? Like, are these a set of ideas that can only occupy one scale? I guess that's the question. I would say at this moment, there is no technique related to something that could be literal in the sense of built. Like, there's nothing here about, for example, some possible innovation with steel structures or waterproofing or whatever it might be. But I think those kinds of things are techniques, and I don't think techniques scale. I think techniques that are materially based are, of course, going to be bound to a certain size and material economy. But I would see this more as being unrelated to material techniques. This is more speculation about a set of concepts about what we call the architectural discipline, what the role of originality is, what the status of abstraction is, and how we make an argument for what the nature of our agency is in the problem of making worlds. So in that respect, it's scaleless, I think, or it's appropriate to any scale you might want to project into. That's why I quite deliberately, in the stuff I take responsibility for as my work, I mean, the student work is, that's stuff that's driven by what's achievable in academic discourse. Right? But what I take responsibility for in my work, I've been focusing on the bioprinter and that infrastructure project. And deliberately, I referred to that talk from last November as kind of small project, big project. I mean, small object, big object. Because I do think it's a set of ideas that can span great distance in terms of just literal size of things. It applies to, I think, essentially everything. But in each project, there are totally different instrumentalities, completely different material logics, completely different engagements with societies and bodies of knowledge. So in order to engage the scale, you actually have to do that. You have to have a relationship to the corporation, or you have to have a lab, and you have to have a relationship to scientists. And so I don't think these ideas are exclusive of that. I think the experiments with the students that I end up with, the work I do in schools, I'm primarily interested in representational problems and the ongoing obsession and anxiety about historical discipline and what we call architecture. That's, I think, a primary concern. And how we could have that conversation in a new way.
How would a student evaluate his own work? Would he just rely on the aesthetic level, on the representation of the image, or is there something else? I understand that's very much what is at stake.
Well, I think the question you ask me is more a pedagogy problem, like what is my attitude as, or method as a teacher, I'll be honest with you, when I'm in studio with the students, I tell them, don't think of me as your professor, think of me as either your shrink or as your coach, right? But this is to try and assert that you're not going to be able to legitimize the decisions you make through some appeal to knowledge. It has to be legitimized by other means, right? And I would say socially, through interactivity and through its presence within the institution. It's quite complex, I think, how it gains legitimacy, but I think that's part of the idiocy of what's become of architectural education as an evidence-based project. This is something Catherine and I discussed yesterday, in fact, that you stand up in front of a jury. It's like a court of law. You present evidence, right, in support of the decisions you made, and the judgment is probably more judgment of you than the work, right? Yeah, see, I mean, you're laughing because it's true, right? And so the question I think should be asked, you see, this is, for me, a totally unrelated issue about the institutionality of architecture, right? Because in the end, I don't really care that much about how legitimate the decisions seem or not. I would rather try to evaluate more as colleagues with my students and all of our peers in whatever institution we happen to be in at the time. Does this project have power And then we do everything we can with the conceptual apparatus that we're constructing, how we construct a discourse about why it has power. Right? And that's really the only thing that keeps it going. The idea of because of this criteria was illegitimate, bad project, that's kind of nonsense.
Thinking about is like, was it like just figurative experience, like the last slides that you showed us? Like, is it just about how the figures touch each other, how another architecture comes out of another architecture, or it becomes like architectural matter as well? Like, what will happen for the space between these guys when these boxy stuff comes from other, let's say, prepared geometries, and when they get together, what happened for the space between them, like really architectural oriented matters?
Yeah, well, something I learned really fast. I remember when I first decided to go for it, right, and just take the risk of being this stupid with Architecture Studio, of just take stuff and combine it to make new stuff. It seemed too stupid to be true. Like, how could this possibly go anywhere? I actually had that thought. So it did constitute a bit of a risk when I first decided to do it. And I thought it might, all right, we try it then, okay, it didn't work, move on. But what I saw very quickly was there's a hell of a lot of intelligence in it. There's a lot of judgment taking place that really can't be, I guess, talked about. There are decisions that can be made about why this piece works here. Is something that cannot be legitimized through some set of concepts. And initially, I saw some of my students attempting to do this kind of cliched thing of, this is my idea, therefore I made this decision to put this over here. Like, see, this is evidence of that idea, and it was a disaster. It looked horrible. You know, it looked like crap, and it was a totally bogus way to legitimize the decisions that were made, right? And so the ones that succeeded seemed to have another form of intelligence that was a pure design intelligence, where it was very difficult to say why it worked, but it did. And it had the effect of completely re-originating the objects because it looked like a drawing that was done by hand for some reason. It had all the coherence of any drawing that we would put forward as an expert architectural drawing. And then, with the 3D stuff of models, with the most recent studio, all these parts coming together, and it looks like a fully formed building, and you can't believe it was just put together from just favorite parts. So what I realized from this is there is a set of criteria and judgment that we make within the discipline, and you need training to be able to do this, that operate within a sphere of what's legible as architecture, and that you don't need concepts to be able to do it. I think that's what I learned. And then conceptualization then becomes secondary to the problem of the original. That conceptualization now, it seems more as a way of reading the possibilities of some object that's been made. That what forms as a thing has logics that are not entirely decipherable, right? But nonetheless, we're capable of doing it. Right? That's what I find so powerful. And that was the intuition I had, the kind of, the blood that I smelled when I saw these set designers, these digital modelers in Hollywood work. It's one thing to see the goofy stuff they make, like these talking animals and castles. But then when you see them actually sit down to model that dragon, it's absolutely spectacular how quickly they're working. And they have a kind of giant file of pre-made digital objects, and they're rapidly selecting morphologies and incorporating it, so they're not constructed on a kind of spline by spline basis. So what I started seeing was there's an incredible formal intuition that operates without any concept. Right? It's just purely a problem of making a coherent thing that becomes legible as something. So it's very contrary, I think, to the way I was trained and to the way I see the majority of the world of architecture trained, which privileges concept before anything else, which then turns the problem of design into a problem of constructing evidence in support of thought. Right? But then you wonder, why does everything look like crap? Because they're nothing but illustrations of some idea, and they have no presence as things in themselves. Yeah, that's that would be the apologist's answer, right? Maybe they're all bad concepts.
I do have one question. In terms of a render as a mean of representation, you did touch upon it with previous answer, but more emphasis like in terms of the criteria of a visualization, like the stylization of it, or the even the appeal factor of it. How do you approach with your students with a set of criteria, or if you do, for the visualization of it?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear everything you said. Could you just maybe say it louder?
So, the render as a mean of representation, when you're approaching your student, is there a specific set of criteria that you set in terms of the appeal factor or the stylization of it? Yeah. Is there a criteria for it?
Yeah. I would have to acknowledge that we're all constituencies, and we operate. And I completely agree with Jeff about one thing, which is we occupy kind of multiplying micro-genres. And the reason why it might have appeal and has legibility is because we're actually part of the same constituency or have overlapping relationships within our constituencies. So I would rather read it that way than to somehow think that there's some absolute reason for why one shape is better than another, right? Yeah, but I think it goes for all things, whether it's a rendering or a form or a type of argument. I think I want to reject that there is some kind of deep accessible truth that we need to access in order to make a judgment about it. I think it's okay for us to look at it and for me and say, all right, that's good. I think that's actually quite profound. I don't think it's trivial at all. And I think it's something that we should value as a discipline, right? To be able to do things that way. There's a very anxious person behind you.
I'm wondering.
Let him attack after you.
Yeah, I'm wondering if once the technique is revealed, if the strange is equally strange, or how does this relationship change? Because at some point, I think some things are not strange enough anymore, since
Yeah. I think the real sad part here about the problem of estrangement is it's quite fleeting. It's very temporary. Like no matter how strange it is, whether it's music or a face or a building or painting, that with enough repetition, it will become horribly cliched and all too familiar. Right? And some of the strangest things that we have in existence at one moment were utterly bizarre. I don't doubt for a second one day things like Boston Dynamics Big Dog is going to be just part of everyday life. I mean, could you imagine the first time they saw a refrigerator? You know, what did you do before that? Or just cold storage? It must have been magical, right? And it's the fate of everything to eventually become familiar. But what I find so interesting about that quote by Shklovsky that I read to you is it actually acknowledges that and sees the problem of how to incorporate artistic techniques, or for us, say, architectural disciplinary techniques, to prolong and stretch out that moment of estrangement as much as possible. That in that prolonged period of estrangement, something might be possible then, in maybe reading, say, New York City a little differently, and not feel like we figured it all out, or like we've learned everything there is to learn about tall buildings, and now all we need are just those numbers to calculate core to perimeter, or how fast the elevator needs to go, or the rate of air handling to produce human comfort. You know, you have charts for things like this, right? But you prolong the estrangement just long enough to begin to question whether or not we have actually figured it all out. And I think that's a very deeply positive thing, you know, for life. To open the door a little bit for some little bit of uncertainty about what life could be. But I think we just have to accept that you can't have that last forever.
I really want to know if you have a special strategy or a next step to change the technique, your beautiful technique, to turn to methodology, because in your one of your articles, molecular
The food
gastronomy, you differentiated the two terminology, the technique and methodology. But in your presentation, there is a lot of techniques, but you didn't mention the methodologies so far. So
well,
if you have a special...
Well, in the article, that's when I first started thinking about the difference between these two words, technique and method. Right? And also I say in the article, I'm 100% against methodology. I want to avoid methodology as much as possible. I'm very pro-technique, but I'm very pro constantly looking for new technique. And to also see that technique is not content. Like, technique is not the end of it itself. That technique has no meaning, right? Methodology is when techniques become collected as a kind of super project that argues that this way of doing things is the right way to do it. And it's the right way because, right, and then fill in the blank, right? So the example I give in that article is the Suzuki method of teaching children violin, which is famous for never having produced a virtuoso violinist. You know, that's like the funny thing about this famous Suzuki technique is actually it turns out to be a really horrible way to train people to be great violinists, right? But if you actually look at the history of Mr. Suzuki and what the idea was, the agenda of the collected techniques, why it was a method, was the purpose was not to train violinists, but to introduce beauty into the lives of children in post-war Japan. There was a right. There was a reason why it was correct to do it this way. Right? So I'm not that interested in elevating a set of techniques to a form of legitimate production according to some political agenda. Personally, I don't think it's an architect's business to do that, even though I think it is the business of political bodies to do that, right? But I think it's my job as an architect to actually fight that and to push that.
Tack så mycket.